As a bourbon drinker, you are subjected to all kinds of marketing, hand-waving, and words that mean nothing, like reserve or small batch. But I'm going to earn my moniker as the Whiskey Dictionary and define some bourbon terms for you that you should probably know. So whether you're a seasoned enthusiast or somebody new to the hobby, there's going to be something for you on this list, and it'll help you the next time you go to the liquor store. First things first, we're going to talk about Mashbill. It's one of the core concepts of whiskey, and it really is just a fancy way of talking about a recipe. So we're talking about all of the different grains that actually are going into your whiskey. Now, a lot of distilleries don't put the Mashbill on their bottle, mostly because they don't have to. And some places even keep it secret, which is kind of silly, because people like myself, you can find it very easy if you just Google around. So if you're ever curious, go look. So, in the case of a Mashbill, in order to legally be considered bourbon, you have to be 51% corn. And that corn can be higher than 51%. And actually, even in the US right now, people are really experimenting with how they can fiddle with their bourbons. So varietals of corn are starting to showcase themselves in different whiskeys. Look at something like Iron Root. They're going a little bit crazy with their corn, and I love it. So in the case of your secondary or tertiary ingredients, you could have things like rye or wheat or malted barley or even malted rye. So in the case of Maker's Mark, for example, this is bourbon. Its primary ingredient is going to be corn. Its secondary ingredient is wheat, however, and so we would call this a wheater. Then you have something more like Buffalo Trace. And this is, again, primary ingredient is going to be corn. Secondary ingredient here is going to be rye, but it's fairly low rye, so it's not going to be something like a high rye, which is what we're going to talk about next. In the case of high rye bourbon, what we're saying is that we have a bourbon, so we're at least 51% corn. Our secondary ingredient is going to be rye. So in the case of something like the Old Grandad Bonded here, this is a high rye mash bill. So this is 63% corn, 27% rye, which is pretty high, and then 10% malted barley. With a mash bill like that, you're going to have kind of this nice supporting depth from the malted barley. 10% is actually pretty nice too. And then the 27% rye is going to help carry forward the spicy, just very intense kind of flavor that's also supported with the sweetness of the 63% corn. It's actually a great mash bill. Conversely to a high rye whiskey, we can have something called a wheater. Now, in the case of something like Larceny or W.L. Weller, these are both going to have wheat as their secondary ingredient. And the flavor profile that a wheated whiskey or a wheater is going to give you is something a little softer. At least in my opinion, that's how they usually come across. I find that it does lean pretty heavy on the corn to give you the sweetness, but the wheat is going to kind of balance things out. I almost consider it more of a dry taste, which is a hard one to describe. But if you like something that's not as aggressive as rye, a wheated whiskey or wheated bourbon or a wheater is something that you might enjoy. These next two are going to be about the mash itself. So the first one we're going to talk about is a sour mash. Now this is very similar, if you know anything about bread making, to a sourdough where you have yeast that is left over from the previous batch. And what this allows you to do in the case of making whiskey is provide a more consistent flavor. So you're going to have your same mash bill that you're putting all in there, but most of the flavor is actually coming not only from the barrel, but also from the yeast strain that you're using. And it's why companies will actually have proprietary yeast strains that they use. It's actually a big deal. So in the case of something like Wild Turkey or Michter's small batch, the sour mash here, the idea is that you leave a little bit left in your mash tun and you reuse the yeast from that in order to make your next product. And it just, like I said, gives you a little bit more consistency. In contrast to sour mash, you have sweet mash. Sweet mash is exactly the opposite. Whereas in sour mash, you're bringing forward your yeast to the next batch. In sweet mash, you are not doing that at all. You're using brand new yeast every single time. And the reason that you might want to do this is because maybe you don't value the consistency from bottle to bottle. You're actually trying to do something new every single time, or even just have slight variations so that you can maybe throw a batch number on it or something like that. So there's a couple of distilleries doing this. Hard Truth Distilling is one, Peerless, and even Woodford Reserve has done a couple of versions of this. But in general, it's a little bit more work, if not a lot more work, and that consistency is not necessarily something that everybody wants to skimp out on. You kind of want consistency in your product, unless you specifically don't. Cask Strength bourbon is the strength that it comes out of the barrel prior to any dilution. So a distiller might choose to take 120 proof or 60% and say, you know what, this is not what I want to sell to my customers because it just tastes like alcohol. Let me dilute it by adding water and then sell it at 90 proof or 45%. Now there's a few reasons that they might do this. Number one is obviously they might decide that it tastes best. And we like to imagine that's the real reason. But they can also make more money. If you take your whiskey and you add water to it, you now have more whiskey, right? And if people like it at that lower proof, then you're going to sell more bottles and it's going to go further and you'll make more money. Now, the third reason is that a higher alcohol spirit actually has to be more expensive because you are paying more in tax. And that alcohol has a higher tax than, say, the water or the glass. So those are all reasons why a company might dilute their whiskey. But when we're talking cask strength, there's a few things to look for. Cask strength could also be called barrel strength. In the case of this old Ezra 7, they call it barrel strength. It's all the same thing. But this is 58.5%. So I would like to fiddle with this. When I drink this, first off, I actually really like 58% whiskeys. I probably wouldn't fiddle with this too much, but if I wanted to add some water to it, I could see what it's like at different ABV, and I could see how I like it. Maybe I really like this at 50%, or maybe I don't. But something to look for is that oftentimes cask strength will be a handwritten label because that percentage can be different from barrel to barrel to barrel. So those are all things to look out for. Personally, a good chunk of the whiskeys behind me are cask strength because it's the way I prefer to drink my whiskey. But if you're brand new to whiskey, you might want to avoid it. It's not really for everybody, and you want to develop your palate before you blow it away with too high of an alcohol. Naturally, from cask strength, we'll kind of talk about the opposite, and we have bottle proof. So in this case, I have two offerings from Old Forester. We have the Old Forester 86 and the Old Forester 1920. As a small aside, this is one of my favorite bourbons of all time. If you haven't tried the 1920, you really, really should. This one is 115 proof, this is 86 proof. And that proof is on the label, so that's not changing. What they're doing is they're taking their barrels and they're proofing it down by adding water. And then they're making it exactly what they think that they know that they want this to be, and they're putting it in the bottle. That's all there is to it. Age statement is one that I think we all probably know, but it's worth mentioning because it's got a little nuance to it that actually really matters. So in the case of these two, we have the Jim Beam Black, which is a 7-year-old, and then we have the Eagle Rare from Buffalo Trace, which is 10 years old. Now, when they put 10 years old on the bottle, which it's actually interesting, Eagle Rare does a very, very small print down here. It's almost like they don't want to pay attention to it, but I find that very strange. Anyway, in the case of Eagle Rare, 10 is going to be the youngest whiskey in there. Now, you don't get a whole lot of this anymore because, frankly, there's a whiskey boom and a lot of things were kind of used up over the last 10 years. So in the past, what they used to do is they would have a 10-year-old whiskey, but they might put like a 12 or 14 or even a 20-year-old whiskey in there along with it in order to make the flavor something awesome. Now, again, they don't really do this anymore because they don't have to. They can sell you cheaper stuff, they can sell you younger stuff, but what they were doing is trying to convince you that this was so good for a 10-year-old. Oh my gosh. And now you're kind of hooked. And now over the years, you've been buying the Eagle Rare, buy it. And maybe it's not as good as it used to be, but it was such a small change that whatever. Anyway, on the bottle, you're going to have a big old number. That's the age of the youngest whiskey in the bottle. When you call yourself a straight bourbon, there's a few rules that you have to follow. First, you can't have any additives, so you can't have artificial flavoring or coloring. But you also have to be over 2 years old. However, if you're under 4 years old, you have to put the age on the bottle. So why don't we see a whole lot of like 3-year-old bourbons rolling around? Well, I think marketing would probably tell you that in general, you don't want to call that out because 3 years old is not all that impressive. You know, it feels like a long time, especially if you have like a kid that's 3, that's a long 3 years. But it's really not in the terms of whiskey. So when you have something like your Woodford Reserve Double Oak or your Evan Williams, and they're both Kentucky straight whiskeys, all that really means is that it's 2 years old and they didn't add anything weird to it. More often than not, what you're really getting, though, is somebody going for a flavor profile, and because it meets the requirements, you may as well put it on the bottle. But it's really not all that impressive. Now, a term that you may have heard outside of the whiskey world is angel's share. Now, angel's share really isn't, it's not like this mystical thing. It's just evaporation. But evaporation across the world is different depending on the country that you're in. For example, Scotch tends to age a little bit slower than, say, Indian whiskey, which ages really fast, and the angel's share can be as much as like 10 to 12%. In the United States, we obviously have various climates. Things like Texas are going to evaporate different than Wisconsin. But generally, we're talking 2 to 5% per year of evaporation out of your barrel. So if you have a really old barrel of whiskey, that thing's not full anymore. It might be like half empty or even 3/4 empty. And that's why something that's like a 20-year-old bourbon, you might not be getting a whole lot of bottles out of that barrel. So the angel share is what we call it because, you know, it evaporates up to heaven, right? But anyway, that's where that term comes from. Well, those are some of the more common terms that you should really know if you're into drinking bourbons. However, I will tell you that I mentioned I love Cask Strength. I have some whiskeys for sale, and you can check them out at whiskeydickpicks.com. Yes, that's the name of the website. You can find a link down below. And they're all high proof, because of course they are. So if you want to check those out, those would be great. Otherwise, thank all these patrons who helped to make this episode happen. And I will see you all later on the Whiskey Dictionary. Cheers.